Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, Law Firm Workspace's Strategy, How Leading Firms are Rethinking Space Needs in a Hybrid Work Environment. We're excited to have you all here today and to welcome our guests, Barbara Dunn and Doug Simon, along with Bill Sansone from Withum. We're looking forward to a great discussion, and we'll start by handing it off to Barbara.
So I have a lot of information here I'm going to share with you very quickly. See if we can cover a lot of territory. The workplace, as we know, has been completely altered due to the pandemic. Everybody's in this state now trying to figure out what the next steps are and how to get back to the office, if they are going to at all. And we've seen the pandemic has brought both gains and losses. People are happy about having, more free time and a more of a work-life balance, but they're also really missing the connections and the mentoring and learning that happens working with each other. So what we're seeing is while working from home supports certain aspects of life, the office really still is the best place to connect. And what we're seeing now is the emergence of a hybrid work model as people look to the future. I think it's really important as you're thinking about planning space, especially if it's a new build out, that you think for the long term. As Doug could probably attest to, most law firms assign to leases that are a minimum of 10 years, often 15. I've dealt with clients who have been in their space 30 plus years. And it's important to think about the viability of that space for people who will be partners in the future when you're signing a lease today. Law firms are historically, I call them space eaters, and they don't even calculate the metrics of square foot per person like every other industry. They do it by attorney, but if you translate it into square foot per person, they use almost double the amount of space that most professional service firms use and other financial, et cetera, industries. We have seen a steady decline in the amount of square footage firms are taking, and now it's 500 or even less, with mobility and remote strategies is not unheard of. Some of the big takeaways we're seeing right now from the impacts of COVID, accelerated trends, if you will. We're seeing firms going to a smaller real estate footprint, but still trying to keep the quantity and numbers of attorneys the same and allow for growth. We're seeing the ability to work anywhere, whether it's inside of or outside the office, and much more of attention being focused on the human aspect of work and people and interaction. Some of the trends, and these are a lot of different images of different projects from our firm. There is really, we're seeing more of a blend of home and office, so there's much more of a hospitality and residential feel in spaces. It's really important to make them welcoming for people, to help draw people back, and even the inclusion of things like restorative spaces, mindfulness rooms, yoga rooms, things like that, we've been building for some law firms. In terms of strategies to help in a time when we really don't know what the future is, flexibility is really important, multi-use spaces. In the upper right-hand corner, you have a reception desk that also serves as a work counter and a bar for events. And the lower right corner, movable walls that allow you to use conference rooms in different kinds of ways. And another aspect we've seen, and this was rising even before the pandemic, we do at Gensler a lot of surveys on the workplace. And one of the big things we were finding in the workplace that was important was this idea of variety and choice and giving people options in how and where they work. And then another emerging trend, which has gotten a lot of force to it these days, is the idea of health and wellness in the workplace. Outdoor access has become more and more important. We're building terraces for a lot of clients now. The idea that you can have fresh air in your space, and the whole kind of transparency and daylighting with the introduction of glass fronted offices. And then this whole idea, especially now that as people have been working remotely, when they do come to the office, that it's an opportunity for people to really connect with each other, and providing the kinds of spaces that are going to draw people to collaborate. So these are some of the key questions we're seeing right now from our law firm clients, trying to figure out how much square footage, what is mobility going to do to how we occupy space, amenities, what does the private office need to be? And mobility is certain, and by that I'm referring to both remote work and mobility in the office. We've seen from our surveys that while 42% of attorneys never worked from home prior to COVID, they're thriving working from home and doing well as firms and with their ability to focus and collaborate. Also, our surveys show that half of the lawyers working now want some kind of flexible work arrangement, whether it's working from home a couple days a week or even full-time at home. And this was interesting, sometimes it's how you pose the question. So when we ask lawyers if they preferred an assigned desk, they all say yes. But when we start to change that up and ask if there was a trade-off and they could have more flexibility and mobility, those numbers start to move the needle. And then it's a big driver is, of course, real estate is one of the most expensive costs for law firms, next to salaries and technology. And if you start to shift the mindset from one-to-one seating, one seat for every person, and start to look at examples of even 30% mobility, you can really realize, 15, 20% savings in the amount of square footage you're taking. And one of the keys is, it's interesting, as much as law firms, attorneys are saying, I don't want to be in the office every day, they're still struggling with the concept of giving up their individual workspace. And more than any other industry, they're focused on this private space, heads down focus work, which is something that's important, but maybe more of that needs to be happening at home. We're seeing a lot of different ways that the office can be configured. Most firms we're building out today are doing universal size offices, same for partners and associates. We're seeing the influx of a lot of interior offices because as things like libraries and records rooms and all, and secretaries, all of that starts to shrink down. All that space you're left with is interior space. And in order to be profitable and use the space wisely, we're seeing interior offices with billable people. One other concept we're seeing is this idea of this day office or cockpit. It's maybe 90 square feet, the size of a large workstation, if you will, but outfitted with a sit-stand desk, and nice wood furniture, and a sliding door, and it has everything in it you need to do your focused heads down work. And then on the extreme, on the right-hand side, is the idea of open plan, which is just starting to emerge at some firms. The idea of first, second-year attorneys can sit in open plan. Amenities are seen as something that can help draw people back into the office. When we survey younger attorneys, they want to come to the office because it's important to be mentored, they want to connect, they want to gain exposure in the firm. And there are several things we found in our studies on the workplace and COVID that the things that are easier for people to do in person is collaborating with others, staying up to date, and addressing problems in the moment. So what are the kind of amenities we're seeing that there's an interest in? One of the big things we're doing now in almost every new build out is this idea of a work cafe. And while attorneys aren't going to, spend a lot of time lounging around in a Google type cafe, like some of the tech companies might have, if you give them an option of a place to work or meet that's maybe more casual in setting, has good coffee and some healthy snacks, it is a draw, and it is that third place I was referring to in the office. Another idea is this including curated experiences. In the lower left-hand corner, you can see this idea of spaces that have things like outdoor terraces, and the market sites. We're seeing more and more marketplace. We're seeing more and more on-site marketplace where there's grab and go food, and it's a place that brings colleagues together. And then I thought it would be helpful if you kind of see how some of these play out in a couple examples here. So I'll start with this universal size office. This is a study we did for an AmLaw 100 firm. They wanted to reduce their footprint and shed space. And we looked at the idea for them of going to one size offices all along the perimeter, the introduction of smaller interior offices, and then a nice reception and conference center that spills out into this kind of work cafe area. We're not so much seeing this old concept of a lunchroom for secretaries, but a shared work cafe for everybody. And then this is a project we're working on as well. It's about to start construction. This is a pretty traditional AmLaw 100 firm. They occupy multiple floors in this building and have traditionally built out space with 3 different size offices and drywall office fronts. And this was an opportunity as they had new leadership come in to kind of rethink this expansion space they needed. They had run out of private offices, and instead of rubber stamping the same thing they had done for the past 15 years, this became this new idea of a commuter floor. There's no assigned seating on this floor. There are offices along the 2 sides of the perimeter that it's office for a day that you can, on a reservation system, book. And then the bulk of the space is this big convening space that has booths and counters and that kind of food marketplace and coffee bar and lots of different places to meet. And not only are there the open spaces to meet, but there's lots of huddle rooms and Zoom rooms and different ways for people to convene. In addition, we provided this area here, which is lockers, so people can store things if they don't want to, take their computer with them or whatever. It's a whole different way of working. And just to give you an idea of what that looks and feels like, this is the commuter floor. You can see the booths and the coffee bar and the huddle rooms, and very different look and feel for a law firm. 2 more examples. There is a renovation example here. Everything you see in the white is existing, so we were able to keep all the existing perimeter office, saving a lot of money. But we basically tore down the interior and introduced interior offices for attorneys and admin and paralegal, and then opened up a lot of the support space out of private offices and departments into more flexible workstations. And lastly, took the opportunity to take an existing lunchroom that actually was on the interior and keeping the plumbing and all, but then expanding it out to the perimeter and creating an outdoor terrace and work cafe. And here you can see the introduction of these blue colored offices, all with glass, letting a lot of light in the space. And then the idea for the terrace, where we take and we blow out the windows in a high rise and replace it with a glass rail and a foldable wall that comes across if you want to keep it closed but allows fresh air and an alternate place to work. And then lastly, another concept here, and in this firm, I'm going to sneeze, sorry. In this concept, some of the new space they added, they actually pulled some of the offices for partners and attorneys away from the window wall to take advantage of some great views, and created this whole kind of activity-based work center where everything kind of just flows into each other. The conference area, the reception, great for events and big meetings, and it spills into all convening space and even game room. And this is what that space turned out like, kind of very, like I was saying, hospitality feel to it. And finally, this convening space and their beloved pool table that gets a lot of use. So that is kind of a quick overview of what we see happening, and I'll turn it back over to Alexandra.
Yes, I'll turn it over to Marci now. I'm gonna turn it off to you, Marci. Oh, Marci, I believe you're on mute.
Great. Can everyone hear me this time? Awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much. I apologize for the audio problems in the beginning. Great presentation, Barbara. I have a lot of questions. I'm sure our audience does as well. I just wanted to kind of step back a second and kind of frame our discussion and why we're talking about this today before we pass it along to Doug. So if you'll allow me to share my screen for just a moment. Hopefully that'll work. Perhaps it won't work. So I'll just kind of go through for it's one of those days. Go through a few points about why this is important. You know, when we're talking to firms about, the title of this presentation is Workspace as Strategy. And a lot of times when firms reach out to us, they're reaching out to us to talk about their strategic planning because there's a big lease coming to an end or requiring negotiations. And today, you know, more and more, they're thinking more about the fundamental questions of who are we and who do we want to be and how are we going to get there? And part of that analysis is, you know, are we going to stay hybrid? Are we going to be a hybrid firm? Or are we going to be remote part-time? Or are we going to require everyone to be back in the office? So these are really big and important questions. As Barbara said, you know, your lease obligation is often your second biggest expenditure after people. So it's not an insignificant decision. So it's really important. A lot of the concepts that Barbara has talked about aren't really that new. And I think Barbara would agree, these are concepts that she was working on prior to COVID. It's just that with COVID, you know, in the last 18 months, some people have said we've accelerated 10 years in terms of how we work and how we're going to work going forward. So when law firms are considering workspace strategy, they're considering a number of things. They're thinking about their growth opportunities and how they're going to expand into new markets. Does the use of workspace change how they might look at geographic expansion? Do they need to have an office space in new markets, or can they just hire people remotely in new markets where they're not presently operating? Big question, obviously, in terms of talent. Looking at those amenities, are we going to have to offer amenities like this just to get people to come into work going forward? Or can we use really modern, well-designed, technology-enabled office spaces to recruit the best new people or to keep the people that we have? Bill and I are hearing a lot from our clients that they're having people resign and giving flexibility as the reason for their resignation. So it's starting to happen. Some people are calling this the era of the Great Resignation. In terms of brand strategy, this plays in as well. You know, if we're going to call ourselves a modern and innovative firm, does our space reflect that? Or does it not? Or if we're a traditional firm, how do we handle the demands for the new workspace of the future? And then in terms of delivering services these days, how are we going to use our workspace as a way of increasing collaboration and serving our clients? And I'm going to ask the panelists in a little bit if they know what clients are thinking about that as well. So Alex, I don't know if you're able to forward it all to our survey responses at this point. If you can, great. If not,
Yeah.
I will just, great.
Does this work?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Awesome. So we're in the middle of a survey right now that we're conducting around the country for managing partners and chief operating officers. It's still open. We'll provide the link at the end if you'd like to participate. But as things stood as of yesterday, we asked firms, you know, what are they planning on doing, or what are they doing right now in terms of return to work? And surprisingly, almost a third of the firms that responded so far have said that they've made the decision to be hybrid permanently. We were actually kind of surprised to see that so far, but they've said that they've made that decision. About 35% said that people are back at least part-time. A little under 30% said that they're back full-time already in the office space. And only 5% said that they're not coming back even part-time until 2022. So it's clear that it's still really a wide mix between firms in terms of how they're handling return to work. Alex, if you want to advance to the next slide. When we asked how many days are you requiring people to come back if they are coming back, and overwhelmingly 45% said that they don't have any specific requirements about how often people have to come back in the office. The most popular answer was 3 days a week to come back to the office so far. But of those people that are requiring their people to come back today, most of them had no specific requirement in terms of number of days. And then just one more slide, Alex, if you don't mind. We asked about their workspace needs, and about 35% said that they were considering decreasing their office footprint. I'm actually surprised it's that low. 45% said that they were already working on space redesign, whether using a firm like Barbara's to do that or doing redesign internally. 30% said that they had already adapted their physical space based on what's going on in the market. And I thought it was interesting, a little over 17% said they were utilizing co-working spaces. We get questions about that from law firms about whether other firms are using that. So we were surprised to see as many said that they were, you know, given privacy concerns, et cetera, that lawyers have in using open spaces like that. So just a glimpse about what we're hearing from our clients and our colleagues out there in the market. So to kind of set the stage. So the other big question is, what do we do if our lease is up? How do we renegotiate? What are firms doing in terms of renegotiating their leases? And that's why we invited Doug to come speak with us about that today. He's doing it day in and day out. And so Doug, would you like to share with our audience what you're seeing? Thanks.
Sure, thank you. And I want to speak about a couple things, and I'm also going to limit how much of the slide stuff I go through because a lot of it is consistent with what Barbara's described. I did a survey with Francis Kaufman Architects, FCA. We came up with very similar stuff, and we'll go through that a little bit as we go. But I first wanted to talk about kind of the general market and what people should keep in mind while they're experiencing things like a lease coming due. First is that one of the things we've had to deal with over the past 18 months has been the greatest disparity in perceived value of a space between a landlord and a tenant. For the last 18 months, for the large part, I can tell people I can help them save money on real estate, and they can say to me, I haven't been going to the office. I don't use my real estate. Why are you saving me money? Whereas the landlord has typically been saying, you know, it's all going to be fine. We got to get past this. But when we do, it'll be just the way it was before. I'm not going to sell my building for 50% of what it was worth before because it's going to be worth 100%. And this is not like the stock market. If you picture the stock market, if every stock was required to be held for 5, 7, or 10 years, then there wouldn't be a stock market crash any one day. It just wouldn't happen. It can't happen. Instead, you have a gradual change in value as leases expire. So that's just to put it in perspective right now. There is no post-COVID plan. We are in a what have we learned from the last 18 months and how do we implement that in a way that makes some sense going forward. realizing that you said 10 years and 18 months, I would say more than that. If you look at that graph that Barbara showed of how for all times work has been going like this, and this has been a great disruptor, I don't even think 18 years is enough way of looking at how much we've been expedited over the past 18 months. The technology is good. It's not great, as we've experienced during this call today. We still have problems 18 months into this. But if this pandemic had happened in 1995, the whole world would have been shut down. So there is something to be said about what technology has done for business, including the practice of law, and where it kind of takes us from here. So I'll go through a couple of these slides, and then we can get back to the questions, because I think that's the best one. And Marci, one other thing about the Great Resignation, the economy is still going very strong and frothy. If the economy were not going strong and frothy, I don't know that everybody would be so quick to say, I'm resigning if you won't let me work at home. So I think all the questions that you asked and got answers to, you would have had radically different answers to those questions right before the Delta variant came out. You would have had radically different questions last summer. So I think all of us are trying to just, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. We're all trying to figure out how exactly to respond to this last 18 months of getting punched in the face. So if you want to go to the first slide, you'll see, no, yeah, keep going. All right, so here you see, when I started doing this 20 years ago, we were targeting 800 or 1,000 rentable square feet per attorney. Now a third of them are at 500. And what's interesting, and Barbara may have seen the same thing, I have clients who don't want to measure it as per attorney anymore. They want to measure it as per attorney serviceable in that office. So if there are 20 offices, but 30 people who can work there, they want to look at the rentable square feet per attorney who can work there. Next slide. This is another thing that has been going on, that the thing has only served to expedite, which is, I remember when I first started doing this, there were several legal administrators, or I'm sorry, legal assistants who sat right outside the office of the lawyer they serviced, and it was one-to-one. That just doesn't happen almost anywhere. And if it does, it's because there's a 103-year-old partner who demands it. For the most part, it's 5, 6, it's quads, it's group of people who will service work on behalf of the attorneys that need it serviced. But it's gotten very, very efficient. So that's happening pretty much across the board and has only been expedited. Next slide. The universal office thing is happening. If it wasn't happening before, it's certainly happening now. If we take it as a given that folks are striving not to spend 9, 10 hours a day, 5 days a week in the office, the size of the office becomes less important. And law firms had always done it not only inefficiently, but probably inversely efficiently. They would take the best, nicest space, the biggest offices, and reward those to the lawyers that spent the least time in the office. I think people are realizing that that's not a good idea, that you want to get, corporate America has gone to egalitarian systems of bringing the office off the glass line. I think law firms are going there too. Since most buildings are square, I think interior offices for lawyers, as long as there is the ability to see outside through a double glass pane, very, very common, and it will continue to get common. So those concessions are just easier to make if you're not there 70 hours a week. Next slide. All right, so what have we learned to do with this whole work from home thing? Well, we've learned, well, for one thing is lawyers and law firms, for the most part of the survey we did, productivity stayed pretty good or got better, right? That's the argument for I don't want to commute anymore. I'm doing really well. We're really productive in this environment. My argument to that, and I don't know, frankly, I can't tell where my wallet stops and my brain starts. I don't know which one I'm thinking with. But the fact of the matter is productivity for 2020 is based on relationships that existed in 2019. To the further we get away from the time where we were all going out together and creating new relationships, the harder it is to think that the existing relationships are going to stay as productive as they were. So while I would agree that I have been as productive on my existing clients over the last 18 months as I was beforehand, I have not been as good at adding new clients and meeting new people and bringing them into the fray. And I think that's where this whole thing starts to break down a little bit. Next slide. Receivables, same thing. Most people said that they did pretty well. And in fact, when you took out the cost of dining out and entertaining and socializing and all those costs that go to the bottom line, a lot of law firms did really well and had very healthy distributions last year. So again, I have the same question about how much that helps going forward. but it's true. The reason everyone's looking to see what the new normal can look like is because they didn't suffer that much last year. Next slide. By the way, when I say didn't suffer that much next year, don't assume that I'm being crass about the idea of health and pain and everything. I'm talking about dollars for law firms. This is another thing that, and I'm going to bring up, my wife's a professor at a law school, and they had a lot of students who were working from home. And what she realized was that not everybody's command station is the same. And while a lot of people say, I don't understand, it's so great to work from home. I have a peaceful place, I don't get interrupted. Other people said, that's fine. I live with 4 generations in a house of 2 bedrooms, and I'm in a closet right now trying to get my work done. So I think it's important to understand what folks are doing and that not everything is the same. But I think we all have learned, those of us who've taken a laptop on the kitchen table and gotten 3 hours of work done at night have learned I don't need to necessarily be in my office to get down my heads down work. And the interesting part about that for law firms is it's not the young people who learn that. It's the 50+ people who thought they could never do it, who have now fallen in love with the idea of working in a bathroom. Next one. So why do people come to the office? Well, what we're learning is it's for productivity. Some people can't get stuff done. If you ask people, not the lawyers, if you ask the staff why they come to the office before this, a lot of people would say it's the community. It's my work friends, right? That's still important. And I can't be the only one on this phone call who feels like you've lost out on a whole group of friends who are not the close ones. They're not the ones that you actually make a point to call every day, but they're the acquaintances in our lives who add meaning and value and depth, and they're just not a part of it anymore. And that's what one of the things people do seem to miss about the office. Next slide. This looked at it as well. This was showing that the long-term support one gets from the office is what makes it valuable. I would imagine, and we'll get to it when we take questions and answers, trying to get something done, even if I could get 8 hours of work done at home, I think I got about 4 hours worth of work done in that 8 hours. Whereas some days I came to the office and felt like I got 12 hours done in my 8 hours. And anytime I had a question, if somebody happened to be here, we resolve those questions and move on in minutes instead of hours, instead of multiple mail going back and forth and back and forth. So it's mentoring each other. And this profession, and this is one of the toughest things I've had, is my clients have come and said, well, the partners love it. They don't want to come back to the office, but they want the associates in there because mentoring is important. And they don't even realize how silly it is to think about how an associate without a partner is a mentee without a mentor. It doesn't do it. So much of this profession is osmosis learning, and it's become less of that over time. When I was a lawyer before I did this, and my first year in the office was sitting in the partner's office and listening to how the phone calls worked, just so I could figure out how I could effectuate that same tone. If I'm not in the office and nobody else is, where's that coming from? Next slide. All right, so this was very similar to the slide you just put up about where are people going, what's happening. And I think there's no question that remote work is for real. I don't think there's any question about it. And I think poorly worded in-office questionnaires that ask people if they would like the ability to work from home, yes. I mean, the answer to that question is yes. If anybody asked you, would you like a free $100 bill? The answer to that question is yes. If they say in exchange for that free $100 bill, would you be willing to come to my office and sit down for 6 hours? Maybe not. So the question really does need to be asked as you described it is, would you be willing to forgo dedicated space in exchange for the flexibility to work remotely 2 or 3 days a week? And there are people who will say, God, yeah. And the other people will say no. And one of the things we'll get to shortly is a lot of people will say, yes, I want my dedicated office. Yes, I want the flexibility to work from home. Thank you very much. In which case, we're not doing a real estate savings here. We're just doing a change in how people work. Next slide. The different ways that we're talking about doing this, the dedicated seat, the free address or unassigned free address, team seat sharing. These are all interesting ways of looking at it. I've seen firms that actually want to try to pair up Jim and Judy and say they're going to be neighbors and they're going to decide together who uses that space. God bless the administrator who has to deal with that firm, because most people's lives are not that easy that they can do it that way. More often what I'm seeing is either dedicated seats, enough of them that most people are going to have somewhere to go, or a hoteling system based on an app where I wake up in the morning, I say I'm coming to work today, they show me which spaces are available, I key in the one I want and I get it. That's going to change the way people are thinking about working, But again, if we go back to the idea of not working 50 hours a week, 5 days a week, you can make some concessions about what kind of space you're working in, and maybe you don't need a picture of your family on your desk. Next slide. Another thing to work about, this is a real world problem, the Wednesday problem, which is if you tell people that they can work when they want to and you don't have any real structure to it, almost every law firm administrator has said they're having a problem Wednesdays. Everybody's coming in on Wednesdays. So if you set it up so it gets disperses throughout the 5-day week, it's one thing, but if you leave people their own accord, Wednesday, for whatever reason, ends up a day that everybody kind of figures, I want to keep my weekends, Wednesday's a natural date. All of a sudden, you come in on Wednesday and there's no spot for anybody to sit. So it's a nice idea, but there is some reason for planning that out in advance. Next. This is one of the biggest questions I have, and I would throw it out to Barbara and the rest of the group, which is I have yet to, now that we've started to come back to the office and we have some meetings that have people who are both in the office and people who are not in the office. And law firms have been doing this all the time because they have remote offices and they deal with several people. I have found it very, very challenging to find a room or a situation that is egalitarian to those who are sitting there and those who are attending remotely, such that everybody feels that they are a part of the meeting, can hear, can contribute, and everything else. This is one idea that I've seen put out there. However, I have a tough time figuring out how the lady closest to us is having any interaction with the guy farthest from us. I'm just not sure that works either. So I welcome it. I don't think anybody has come up with a perfect solution here. Google put out in the Wall Street Journal earlier this year a couple of kind of crazy ideas about a fire pit type conference room all looking down at something, but I don't think anybody has solved this particular problem. Next slide. This is exactly what you talked about reduction. We're seeing good 36, 46, 50% almost saying that they're going to reduce by up to 20%. Beyond that, I don't know, but I have certainly heard empirically of personal injury firms who are talking about going fully virtual, insurance firms that are talking about going fully virtual, and I think those will exist. Do I think the AmLaw 100 firms will go that way? Not a chance in hell. And I'll explain why in just a second. Keep going. All right, just go to the last one, because I think we've talked about the summary here, which is that remote working isn't going away. I think the genie is out of the bottle, and people are used to kind of knowing how they want to. There's something to being able to deal with a couple of multitasks at once that doesn't require a commute that sort of works. So I think we have to look at how that's going to require people to change their practices. And the next 2 to 5 years are going to change this system, because our country is not smart enough to change the way we do for all times based on a pandemic that lasts a few years, because we're not going to think that the pandemic is going to happen again. We're going to think we're past it and where do we go next? So we'll see what happens, but I don't think we're planning for the next pandemic. We have to figure out a way to deal with collaboration and mentoring, and we have to deal with how to do conferences. But why is this not going to happen to immediately change things? Aside from the fact that not every lease is expiring, and a lot of 70% of people's leases aren't expiring in last year, this year, or next year. We came down with the fact that most firms want to be on, and one of my clients coined this term, most firms seem to want to be on the leading edge, but not the bleeding edge. And most firms would like to be first to be second, meaning that they're all in a big race, but nobody wants to be first, because law, like everything else, is subject to the 80-20 rule, which means you have 20% of your lawyers making 80% of your profits. And if any one of these changes results in one of those lawyers saying, you know what, I'm going to go up the street because they're going to give me an office and let me work from home 4 days a week if I want to, you've just lost all the benefit to doing this. So there's an article that we posted, I'm not going to go through it all now, but talked about the 5 P characteristic of a law firm, the people that make you up, your peers, your profits, your portability and teams, and the paper that everybody builds upon. And how all 5 of those things are sort of rooted in the importance of an office as a work hub for law firms. So what I see is a law firm saying, okay, if I do this remotely, I've now created a whole real estate practice that can be picked off by another law firm. I've now created a person who really sees no relationship to their neighbors except being a box on the same screen with a similar formatted background. So it is a heavily traditional industry, a heavily conservative industry. So you'll see incremental change, but probably not revolutionary change except on the margins. And with that, I would say I am open for any questions. And if you want to get that article, we did post it on here. I think that can be arranged for you to have.
Thanks, Doug. Are there firms that, even though their leases aren't set to expire, are approaching their landlords and trying to use the buying power that they have now
That's
to get some concessions or get some
that's a great question.
improvement?
In the midst of the recession, I mean, in the midst of the pandemic, there were a lot of law firms coming to their landlords and saying, I'm not using my space. In some cases, the state won't let me use my space. Help me do something. And what we saw was a lot of landlords who were decent landlords saying, we'll let you suspend rent for 3 months and pay that portion of rent that you would have paid in increments over the balance of your term so that we get paid back, sort of accommodations. We have also seen landlords, one of the biggest landlord in Philadelphia, approach virtually all of the tenants in their buildings and say, if you're willing to extend, we will give you 1 month of free rent for every year you're willing to extend. The reason is they're scared to death, right? That's an easy thing to do, is say, stay in your inefficient floor plate and go ahead and keep backing out further years. I'll give you a month this year. That's easy. It's very hard when you're doing a law firm renegotiation to get away from the landlord shifting your obligation to another time, as opposed to actually giving you the benefit. So if you have maybe 3 years to go and you're not actually ripe, but you can push that by saying, listen, we got to redo things completely. You want to let us do it here early, you have a possibility of, you have a chip that nobody else has. You can let us save money between now and 2026. But if you hold us to our current obligation, we can tell you we're leaving. It doesn't make any sense to stay here afterwards. And it's a question of how hard you can push that. The other thing we are seeing in terms of, I spoke to you about how landlords don't want to cripple their rental rates because it immediately cripples their building valuations. Sub-landlords aren't doing that. So whereas a lot of law firms have said, we're going to adopt this hoteling thing. So the way we're going to do it, we're 5 floors right now. We're going to get everybody off of 26 and we're going to sublease that to somebody else. Well, they don't, if they cut the rental rate on 26, that doesn't hurt their building's valuation, right? It's lost money that they can see if they can get some of it back. So we've seen a very hyper-aggressive sublease market. And with the hyper-aggressive sublease market comes the landlord market saying, we're willing to get in the mud too. So it's all a question of how hard people are going to push and how realistic your options are. If I have somebody with 9 years left, which I do, and he called me up, he said, what can I do? I have 9 years left. We're in twice the space we need. Look for a subtenant because your landlord doesn't care. Unless you're going bankrupt, they're going to take the rent.
Got it. Barbara, we had a question about geographic differences. We have people on the webinar from all over the country. Are you seeing any differences between the coasts or in the Midwest or in other regions in the country? Does it depend on where you are in terms of how you're approaching design?
To a certain extent, it does. A lot of it depends on some of the larger firms where the home office is. Often affects the attitudes of the satellite offices. Interestingly enough, while the West Coast often is perceived as being more progressive, I see from my counterparts who are doing spaces in DC and New York, much more progressive attitudes about space. New York, obviously, because rents are so high. Probably the biggest difference I see is in areas like Silicon Valley, where we're working with one firm now who the managing partner is, nobody's going to get an office. We're all going to be an open plan. And I want to see him sell that to his partners, but it is, kind of mirroring your client type.
I would add that the space is so expensive in New York and San Francisco that you have more people doubling up on offices. And so you have rentable square feet per attorney metrics that are unachievable anywhere else because It's for some reason acceptable to shove 2 associates in 100 feet in New York and San Francisco.
Doug, you were talking about technology and this concept of fourth space or third space. Have you guys seen firms doing anything innovative with technology in terms of how when they're rethinking the design of their offices?
The firms that we work with who are MLaw 100 and 200 firms have the best video conferencing stuff that's out there. So I think in terms of a place that was ready for it, they are more ready for it. I think it's the smaller firms, actually, just like any other small business, that thought that a webcam over the TV was fine, that now realizes that it's 5 little ants at the end of the table and you can't have a meaningful conversation.
Right.
And I honestly, I mean, I'll be very curious. I think this is going to take time. And I've been geekish with people and said the only time I've ever seen anything that kind of works was the Jedi Council scene in one of the Star Wars movies, where they had a bunch of holograms talking to each other. But it's very, I haven't seen it. And when Facebook says, well, we're going to have avatars to meet up in virtual, I don't buy that. So I could be wrong. I could just be old. I just don't know exactly how you achieve that feel of an actual meeting where you don't speak to all 12 other people at the meeting at the same time all the time. And in a Zoom meeting, it is. Everybody who speaks is speaking to everybody else all the time.
Do either of you have a sense of whether clients care what law firms do in terms of their space? I mean, my sense is that law firm clients are still trying to figure it all out themselves. But have you heard anything?
I don't think it's about that. From my experience, and I would see what Barbara has to say different. From my experience, for the last 5+ years, the law firms have been building to attract lawyers. That most of their meetings with their clients are at their client's office. They do want to be nice and professional because that helps with recruiting also. But I think they're building more for their own use than for what their clients expect. And I think in some ways it's possibly the opposite, that law firms have always been afraid to get too opulent depending on what their client looks like, because they don't want the client thinking my bills pay for that pool table.
Marci, I have 2 questions. I know one last week we had a managing partner roundtable with another real estate agent in New York, and he seemed to think that law firms were not expending any money towards capital improvements or leasehold improvements. And there was a bit of debate that went on during the roundtable where some law firms says, hey, wait a minute, yeah, we are spending money. Do you see law firms, A, are they spending money to do this? B, how are they setting the monies aside, or is it a big budget item that they need to account for and maybe talk to their lenders for, about?
Well, I see many of the firms I'm working with, if it's not a lease expiration, as somebody was referring to, the legal market being pretty healthy right now, they're needing to expand, and they're out of offices, they're out of private offices, and what's happening is they're taking additional space or reworking space that they have that's maybe underutilized or misused, and they are making that investment. And I guess they're actually able, with some of these concepts like the commuter floor I showed, get more attorneys, account for more attorneys to be able to come into the office, and that billability offsets a lot of the capital costs.
Bill, let me give you two thoughts on that. One is, I've seen a number of firms who just say that people have shown they can work from home. We're not taking more space right now. Work from home, and we'll figure it out on the other side, because it's sort of a expensive venture. I do know of one firm that went to vaccination requirements, that quietly leased a little bit of space for people who wouldn't agree to that, so that they could go to the unvaccinated area, which is sort of a strange concept by itself, but that does exist. But I definitely think that's some of it, is just to say, we've shown this is working, so if you want to use it, use it. The other thing is, you asked about flexibility in terms of leasing. We did a lease for a AmLaw 200 firm that had a lease that expired during this whole thing. It expired at the end of this year, and we've been working for about a year in advance. And we executed a lease which was we nailed down everything, the square footage, the rentable, the TI allowance, everything else, but not the actual square feet. They actually had 24 months to determine how many square feet they wanted to take. And then they could decide, and that's when the TI was funded, and that's when everything happened. So they were able to use their size and leverage in the marketplace to get the flexibility to say, listen, anybody who tells you what's going to happen after COVID is lying. We don't know. What we want is the flexibility to learn our lessons and apply them.
I'm seeing that too, where that landlords, that's one way they're bending, is to allow you to If you sign up, then we'll negotiate how much space you're going to take in the future.
Interesting. We have a question from our audience. For firms that have gone to the universal office size, what are the reactions of the partners after they've settled in, and do they experience any regrets or communicate any regrets about making that move?
I haven't seen that because it really is a whole process. So you don't just build it and then say to everybody show up. You have to build a lot of consensus. You have to build an understanding with the partners why they're doing it, and sometimes convince them. I actually see even greater pushback about having clear glass front offices than I do about universal. It's becoming the norm though, and ultimately, if you can show to them that it means more money in their pockets in the long run, it's a little easier to convince.
And you also generally say, I mean, what the words I've always heard the architects say is there's less me space and more we space. So you are giving that up, but we're gonna be giving the firm better space for it. I also just have to give a funny story because every time I hear universal audience or office, I think of this. I had a client who was very nervous about it, and we actually had the contractor set up a office in an empty floor so that they could kind of walk in, and they had the partners walk in, sit down at the desk, and new systems furniture, and each time they came out saying, yeah, I could probably do this. But at a partnership meeting, the managing partner stood up and said, we've had this thing upstairs. The office upstairs that we do is a 10 by 12 office, which is absolutely big enough for me. Does anybody here need a bigger office than I get? And there was just not a single hand up in the air, and that's how it was settled forever. So it's a question of how you wield your power.
Right.
And the most important thing around that is partners want to be able to meet with at least 2 or 3 other people in their office. And if you can accommodate that, usually it's an easier sell.
Can you give any recommendations about talking to senior law firm leadership about the needs of Gen X, or probably more likely millennials or diverse employees when they're thinking about office space? Are there any special needs, or how do you communicate with senior leadership about that?
I think they need to communicate. I would be presumptuous to say that I could do that. I just think that you need to make sure that whenever you're making these decisions, somebody put an outline up of how long 10 years is. It's a long time in terms of how long people are dealing with an office, and you have to bring in the constituents who are going to be dealing it for that length. The young people are not the ones making the decisions, but they're going to live with those decisions, and so they have to be heard. And I think that the more millennials who are in the positions of leadership, the more they are being heard. But that's just a question of knowing your firm. Same thing with there are firms where having a big office is a really important thing. It's ego-based, and that's never going to change. There's no one-size-fits-all solution here.
Right. Bill, do you have any more questions for our guests? Are we all set?
Yeah, I do. As a matter of fact, the one thing that, I've been speaking to a couple of different managing partners in the last few weeks, what they noticed during COVID, they were all considering an admin pool, whereas I think I forgot whose slide it was. They were talking about it was 1-to-1, now it's 5-to-1. Do you see, like, when we're talking about office space, we're talking about not only admin people, but maybe paralegals and things like that? Where do you see that all being a little bit different, and how does that fit the plan that they're all working on going forward?
A couple things I would answer about that. One is, as far as paralegals go, they're usually a very profitable center for a firm. Not always, but oftentimes very profitable. And what I have seen, firms that are looking to change their ratios without doing anything major, a long time they've been building secretarial stations and paralegal stations on the same footprint, but with different walls, so that you could kind of achieve some of that privacy stuff going forward. And again, I know it's not a great answer. I don't think there's a one size fits all. I think some people like to have a dedicated admin that they can really know they're getting. And other firms are very seriously thinking about taking a large portion of their firm administration and relocating that outsourced to a low cost, low real estate, low labor cost market, that it can be done that way. On the other hand, if you look at what you save, some people say it's not worth it to me. I'd rather have that person in the office so that if I have questions, I'm not dealing with going to a Florida office to deal with it. So it really depends on where you want to spend your dollars and how you view those people as part of the firm. Because there's definitely something to be said about shooting them away from the office and creating a different firm than you had beforehand.
Great. Well, we're going to try to end on time. Barbara, Doug, we really appreciate you participating today. Thank you so much. It's a very timely issue. A lot of people are considering it, so we really appreciate your experience and your advice today. Thank you to everyone for participating. We're still conducting our law firm leadership survey. We're going to drop a link in the chat if you'd like to be involved in that. Give us some feedback, and we're happy to talk to you about how your answers compare to the other firms that are responding to the survey. We're going to have some more of these webinars coming up in the future, so please check your email, and we hope you'll join us again. And thank you all for your time today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for attending our webinar. Please remember to take a moment to complete the online survey. Thanks and have a great day.